I really should have. Okay. I really should have done a testing before we actually open this, but looks like it's fine. Wish I could cover that down there a little better. But I think that's the box to my monitor down there. Anyway, before we actually get started, I'll just wait a few minutes. Gotta do the social media stuff anyway, right? Posing that, yeah, we're back. My keyboard is super loud. It's one of those like hardcore mechanical gaming keyboards, which I'm sure you guys already know that, but it is one of those things where like anytime I type, you like hear a lot of noise. It's one of those things that like the nice thing about using Discord for like a lot of my other endeavors. I mean, I kind of wish that like OBS had a way of doing like similar noise suppression things like on Discord, but you know, it can't be helped. Okay, I need to do this. Put a dark screen on so it's not like glare. It happens every time, right? It happens every time. So it's a bit of that glare. Hmm. I gotta do a lot more for the social media things because, like, you know, we're kicking off the new year. So, gotta put the word out there that, yeah, you know, Streaming Parson's back. We're doing all this content that we did before. Because I took a little break from some of the stuff we did on the channel, but now we're, like, kind of back to, like, the older programming that we did. I mean, obviously, we're doing our Bible reads. We are back with that, which obviously is what today's is. Then, of course, I'm actually doing games on the channel again. Stuff like that, right? Because I took like 4 months off because I was pretty burnt. And of course, like one was a big transition as I was like working more in the fall, and so now that I'm more in the groove of it, I think it'll be a lot better. Anyway, okay, let's get rid of this. I don't need this right now. We'll start in a few minutes. Just you know, waiting for more people to show up, and whatnot. So. Kind of wish there was a better way of dealing with these, but whatever. Just close that. I actually managed to get the video up early today. Because of course I wasn't working today, so there's that, right? That's a big deal. So that's a big reason why I'm actually early and not like super tired, starting the stream. So that was nice. That's kind of nice, right? But anyway, I really gotta stop doing that too. Like that should be like a New Year's resolution, but there's no real point of making New Year's resolutions in my mind. I mean, at least not in the traditional way that we do New Year's resolutions. Maybe I'll talk about that on Monday more. As Monday we do talk about, I'm gonna do a podcast about how we go into 2022. But anyway, hello and welcome to the streaming Parson reads the Book of Luke. And yes, today we are doing something, drastically different from what we've been doing for our Bible reading streams. Because last year, I read through 5 different books of the Bible. And they were all the early, they're all pretty old early Testament. Well, I guess technically 7. But I count, the Book of Samuel as one book and the Book of Kings as one book, right? So I did Genesis, Exodus, I did Samuel, Judges, not in that order, because I forgot that I did Judges. Judges was the other book. I was like, what are the 5 books I did again? So it was Genesis, Exodus, Judges, Samuel, and then Kings. But if you count the 2 Samuels as 2 different books and the 2 Kings, that would be 2 more books. That would be 7 books that we did in the course of last year, which was quite a bit to cover. But, this year we're going to cover a whole bunch more. In a way we're going to do more books because, of course, this year, I'm going to primarily focus more on the New Testament. At least for the first half of the year, if even it takes me that long. I think it'll only take me to 4 months, till April basically, to do Luke and Acts. I think it'll only take about that long, maybe a little bit longer. But I don't see it going too much further than 4 or 5 months tops, right? To do Luke and Acts. And then, of course, once you get past Luke and Acts, right, if I do, some of the Paul epistles, I'll do the Book of Romans as well. But the Book of Romans is, the longer, it is arguably the longest. I think 1 Corinthians is a little bit longer. But the Book of Romans is the longest of Paul's letters. And that one is really not that long, right? I mean, to be fair, when I did the Book of Judges was super short, right? The Book of Romans, I think if I did... For the study of the Book of Romans, we'll do those streams a lot differently. They won't be long studies like we're going to be doing with Luke and Acts. Romans, I'll probably take it 1 chapter per stream. And then we just dissect the hell out of all the theology because Romans is so rich in it, right? That I could make 14 streams on the Book of Romans, right? 1 for each chapter, basically. And then a few of the extra ones at the end, but whatever. But you get the idea, right? If even then, right? The New Testament will probably cover a lot more books because after the Book of Romans, you jump into Corinthians or something, and I could probably do the book of 1 Corinthians in 3-4 streams tops, right? Because you just blow through those ones pretty quickly. But we'll see when we get there. I mean, I know I'm jumping way ahead of you, right? You're probably thinking what? I thought we were just starting the Book of Luke today, right? We're just gonna start nice and easy today. Which we are. We're gonna start nice and easy today. And that will be with chapters 1 to 3 in the Book of Luke. Which, as I've summarized it in the description, it's basically the early life of Jesus / pre-ministry life. And yes, that means we'll be doing basically another Christmas read because the other nativity story. So for those of you who were here 2 weeks ago, I did the Book of Matthew account of the birth of Jesus, or more accurately, the finding of the baby or kid Jesus, or whatever you want to call him, toddler Jesus. And so the Book of Matthew focuses more on the search of Jesus as opposed to retelling the account of how and when he was born. But the search of, the coming king. That was the whole way that Matthew kind of takes the story. The Book of Luke takes it from a very different angle. And In the book, there's so much things to talk about in the book of Luke, so I feel like doing 3 chapters is already going to be a lot. This is going to take like the whole 2.5 hours, give or take. Because I'm saying 2.5 hours for future plans. my voice is pretty raspy. Sorry. Anyway, what was I going to? Oh yeah, so with the book of Luke and the beginning, reading, through the book of Luke, and I'm going to do fewer chapters at a time because let's be real, I'm just going to lay you like it is. We're going to do a lot more study in the book of Luke. One reason is because I know the book of Luke a lot better than, say, the book of Kings. If you guys remember when I was reading the book of Kings, I only did like some literary analysis and how the story itself was written, but not really like a lot of deep theological or even like more educationally rich, which is kind of the point of me doing these Bible reading streams. I tend to take it from a more academic view, a more academic view. But with the Book of Kings, you could tell that Book of Kings is not one of the books I know as well as other books. But I'm gonna just tell you this now: the Book of Luke and the Book of Acts, for sure, I know a lot better than some of the Old Testament books. Like the only book I knew really well is like Exodus. So, and then Genesis to a fair extent, because of course I did my thesis on the Book of Genesis. But like Exodus and Genesis were like the ones I knew really well, right? And then like the other ones, I just kind of like, okay, here's some things that like some Bible scholars said. I'll just regurgitate what they said, kind of thing. But with the book of Luke and Acts, there'll be a lot more content. So I'm only going to cover 3 chapters as opposed to like doing 4 chapters. We'll see as we get through later chapters in Luke, because some of the later chapters are much more like narrative wise, and they're less study of theology and academic than just studying a story, right? I know that sounds weird, but you'll see what I mean when we cover those later chapters. But when it comes to today's reading of Luke 1, 2, and 3, we're gonna, a big reason for a lot of the studies, because we have to do a lot of preface work, and I have to talk about how this, how the book of Luke came about, why it's structured the way it is, etc., etc. And so that is going to be the approach that we take the book of Luke, and so, that I'm going to do these Bible studies, and then I'll kind of explain more of how we approach the book of Luke as the book of Luke. But before we start, I'll give you a bit of time to flip to Luke 1. I encourage you to read along, have your own copy, just do the lazy thing and just use BibleGateway.com on your desktop or something. Like, totally using a digital Bible is cool. I'm not one of those, like, mega prudes that are like, oh, you must have a paper copy, right? Relax, right? As long as the Word of God's out there, and you're using the internet, like, more power to you for using the internet copy. Saves your paper, right? We gotta save trees. Of course, now we're just draining water and using metal, right? But I mean, you have to use something, right? You can't get something from nothing, right? That's just life. But anyway, we're gonna start with. Well, we're gonna do a preface before Luke 1, and we have a lot to talk about. I'm already in this for 13 minutes, so let's just start off with a quick word of prayer to kick us off for 2022. So let's just bow our heads for a quick minute. Lord Jesus, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I just pray that as we read through the early chapters of the book of Luke, I just pray that you would reveal to us who you are, and guide us in our study of your word, and for us to awaken in us, the desire to search for you and to know you in our daily lives. I pray this in the name of I just pray this in your holy name. Amen. Okay, so the book of Luke. Before we actually start reading, we got a lot of like stuff to talk about, right? So, I mean, anytime I introduce a Bible book, I have to do this, just so that, as we go through, the later streams, I kind of hope to have these grounds covered so we don't have to go back to it every time. So we're gonna do like this huge. I'm gonna do this huge info dump right now before we actually start reading. So the New Testament is very, very different from the Old Testament, and you're probably wondering, well, how so, right? I mean, you're probably not really wondering. It's kind of obvious why. Um, the the New Testament is very different. So by the time the New Testament came around, a little bit of history within like the canonicity. Canonicity. Now there's a weird word, right? You don't hear very often. So the canonicity of the Bible is something that many, Christians, when they talk about like what books of the Bible should be included, because there are other books of, you know, that could have been used, right? And I talked about this when we were doing the Book of Kings, right? And how the Book of Kings, they refer to another book that wasn't included in the Bible, but clearly had historical information. The annals of the kings, right? But they were never included in the Bible. And of course, the main reason why most people think they were never included was because the Book of Kings was concerned with how the people, primarily the kings, related to God, right? The Annals of the Kings, whatever book that may be, may not necessarily have done that. And so when the Bible was edited by the priestly order during, after the Babylonian exile, which we'll talk a little bit about. But when that happened, the editing of the Bible, if you will, when that occurred, one, it was very likely that the Annals of the Kings were lost. So they couldn't have added it if they wanted to. And that's probably why the Book of Chronicles is the way that it is. So if you look at like the years certain books of the Bible were added, so this is a little technical thing that's kind of hard to kind of just explain to you. But, I hope you guys, go back to this video, and then maybe in future streams or something I can do like a more thorough explanation of this. But I'm gonna just kind of do a TLDR of this kind of Bible composition history. So when we had at the end of the Book of Kings, right, if you remember, Israel and Judah had been defeated by their neighboring, the neighboring superpower, right? Because Israel used to be a superpower in the day of Solomon, relatively. But, when the Babylonian Empire show up and the Assyrian Empire and all these, big, you know, big people show up, Israel gets pretty quickly conquered and Judah not long after. And then there basically begins something called the Exile. And the Exile lasts for about 70 years. Now I say about 70 because even though there was 70 years that were like confirmed, it's not like after the 70 years everybody immediately went back to Jerusalem, right? So, a year or two after, it took them a while to get back, right? And that's kind of the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. Two books I did not cover in the Old Testament. Maybe we'll come back to them one day. I don't know. But basically, we may come back to it, but the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, basically what they cover is when the Israelites return to, well, the land of Israel, and primarily the people of Judah return to Jerusalem. This is where we get the modern term of Jews, right? So when people say they're Jewish, well, from a national sense, it refers to that people group, right? And they kind of dissociated themselves from Israel, and two, any of the other people groups that would have emerged during the exile, and even a little bit before that. This, of course, led to, there were some problems in like the political world of Israel at that time. And of course, what we would greatly frown upon now as modern people, like, for example, the Jewish people, for lack of better words, being extremely racist in that they were all about this like racial purity. And so in the book of Ezra, there was even this whole like purging, for lack of better words, where they kicked out all the non-Jewish wives that men had taken when they were stuck in Babylon. They even kicked them out and sent them back, and that was an ugly thing, right? And there was this whole like keeping the people Jerusalem, like pure Jews kind of thing. And of course, the way that in the book of Ezra they understood it was that the reason why they were kicked out of Jerusalem in the first place, or conquered, depending on how you look at it, the reason why they were kicked out of Jerusalem in the first place was because they disobeyed God. And one of the things, and you know, we talked about this when we were going through the book of Kings, where a lot of kings would take up foreign wives, and then, I mean, Solomon was the, you know, the prime example of this, you know, taking his like 700 wives and 300 concubines, most of them being foreign women, and then he was led to worship their gods, right? And so the Jews thought, well, because we have all this foreign influence, that's what made us, you know, displeasing to God. So we're going to reset everything. And then they tried to go for this racial purity thing, and you know there were all kinds of problems with that. This also led to the emergence of how the lost tribes of Israel. Now, and there's a lot of, that's its own crazy lecture altogether. But the lost tribes of Israel were basically the other people groups, because Judah, when we talk about Jews, we refer to the people of Judah. Of course, there were some Benjamites, because Benjamites were pretty common in that area, because Saul, there was the family of Saul and people of Saul's tribe, you know, were still respected. So those two stuck around. So there was Judah, and then there was Benjamin, of the 12 tribes of Israel. But the other 10 were basically like kind of frowned upon, because they were like, well, you guys kind of messed up real big, right? With the whole, you know, Israel falling earlier. And so Judah was like, we don't want to have much to do with you. So they're like, yeah, Jews hating on Jews, right? Like that's the pinnacle of racism right there. And so they were like, we don't want much to do with you. And then of course, on top of that, there was a lot of interracial like relations, and a lot of how do I put it? How do I put it nicely? Right, there was a lot of interracial people groups that were being, you know, produced, if you will. The Samaritans being the big one, right? But the Samaritans managed to stick around a lot longer. They survived for a pretty long time and even became their own group, right? And we'll encounter a little bit of the Samaritans in the New Testament, because, of course, by the time we get to Jesus' time, they're a thing, right? Of course, the Samaritans were around much earlier, but there wasn't a lot talk about them. But they were a people group, and obviously, by the time we get to the New Testament, we have the Samaritans. And so a lot of, anyway, I know I'm sidetracking a bit. So going back to the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah, which would have been the end. So all this crazy like stuff of like how Judah was reevaluating itself, and Jerusalem rebuilding their new society from the ground up after returning from the Babylonian exile. And there was a lot of remodeling that they had to do for their society. This was a big part of, you know, Israel's history, because once they kind of did this restructuring, they tried to stick to it as best as they could, and they actually kind of maintained it, although there was obviously tensions when other superpowers started showing up. Now these parts that I'm going to talk about next were not included in the Bible. And the biblical and the theological reason was probably because there wasn't a real prophet. Now, when I say the word prophet, I'm going to use this term kind of loosely as I talk about it in this sense. So when I say that Israel had no real prophet for 400 years, basically they didn't have anyone that would directly say to people, you know, the thus says the Lord kind of stuff. You know, the kind of stuff you find in the book of like Amos and Hosea, you know, those kind of books. And anytime these guys talk, they tend to say, thus say the Lord, right? Because the idea was they were representing God, like directly. But apparently that didn't really happen for a long time. And so Judah kind of just did whatever, right? And they tried their best to maintain this Jewish purity. But of course, you know, there were problems when the Greeks showed up and the Romans showed up. And of course, you know, the Romans are pretty important to talk about, because they were a pretty big superpower and changed a lot of the way the world was, right? So I know I just kind of like did a throwaway sentence of basically 400 years of history that the Bible does not include. So the last part of the Old Testament, on a chronological sense, even though if you were reading through the Bible, the books are divided weirdly. You could say that the book of Nehemiah would be the end. Well, Ezra and Nehemiah, they would be the end of the Old Testament in a timeline sense, and that roughly is like 400 BC. And then we have 400 years of history that just happens, and Jews dealing with Greeks and Romans, and of course the rest of the world doing whatever the rest of the world is doing. Fast forward now to the beginning of the New Testament. The New Testament begins 400 years after that event. Now, of course, we could have picked any of the 4 Gospels, but I chose the book of Luke, one, because it's the one I know best, and secondly, it connects with the book of Acts the best, and thirdly, I think it's the best one for, when I'm doing these kind of videos. It's for us to study from. I think Luke has the best way of approaching it from an academic lens, which is, my style. You guys know me well enough. I've been doing this thing for over a year now. You guys know my style, and the book of Luke fits that style. If you want to study another one of the Gospels, we can do that on like a more private lesson, I guess you could say. But for the purpose of these streams, I'm going to be much more academic, and the book of Luke allows that. So that's why we're using it. But really, we could have basically from the timeline sense, we start from the book of Luke. Of course, then you run into another issue, which is the order of stuff Bible books were written. And I kind of imply this with like the Old Testament, for example, even though Genesis from a timeline sense begins with like God from the beginning of time, right? So sense the beginning of the timeline. Technically, from a authorial sense, Exodus would have been written first, right? Because Moses would have written about his life before he wrote about other revelations God gave him, right? In the same way, the Gospels are actually behaved in this way. And the Gospels were written like, what, 30... The book of Luke is said to be written about 40 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, right? So most Bible critics would say that, yeah, the book of Luke, we could say it was written about 70 AD, right? And so the common belief was that Jesus, was about 30-something when he died. And so that would be 30 AD, give or take. And then 40 years, which would be about 70 AD, was when the book of Luke was written. Now, of course, some people would say, well, why would they wait so long after Jesus' death to actually write stuff about him? Of course, we run into something that's been... And, it's funny where a lot of people criticize the Bible for this, but really every culture does this. And so... But the Bible, ironically, does it with a much better sense of time than other traditions. So, in contrast... Okay, before I do that contrast, go back a little bit of, the book of Luke being written roughly 40 years after Jesus' death. And the reason why they would have waited to write it down was because a lot of the stories of Jesus would have been orally told, right? It'd be like, how do I put it? It's basically like all the stories of Jesus would just be what the guys talked about on Sunday, right? You go to church and we just talk about Jesus, right? And they talk about the stories. And then everybody just kind of orally transmitted the stories, right? And so if people were doing this via, just talking about it, and remember, within the 30 years, 40 years after Jesus died, a lot of these guys that followed Jesus were still alive, right? A lot of them were still alive. And so because of that, there was no reason to write it down. They would just tell each other, I always had this funny picture where, like, at Sunday mornings, like, I know in modern Christianity we formalized a lot of it, and there was obviously some of that, as we see Paul talk about in the book of Corinthians. There was obviously some formality to it, but half the time, like, you read in the book of Acts, half the time, like, the disciples are just kicking around, having some wine, and just talk about, like, man, wasn't it awesome when Jesus did this, or wasn't it awesome when Jesus did that? Remember when Jesus told us this and that? Like, that's basically what the guys did, right? And then we just sit around, drink beer, and talk about Jesus, right? That's kind of what Sunday was for a lot of these guys in the earliest days of the church. But of course, as time passed, they had to formalize it because, some of these guys were getting older, some of them were dying, some of these guys get martyred and stuff, right? And we'll talk about that a lot more in the book of Acts. But basically, the oral tradition would no longer work, right? Because all these guys are getting older and, you get less of these guys, right? And sure, you get a lot of Christian converts, but it's not exactly the same as, the people who were there when Jesus was around. And of course, there's the whole, like, skepticisms of, like, well, since no one today was around when Jesus was around, none of us can truly say whether he rose from the dead. People like to throw that argument when people ask, did Jesus really rise from the dead? Well, none of us, in 2022 were around, over 2,000, like almost 2,000 years ago to verify, right? But this is where the apostolic tradition was born out of creating the text. So the apostolic tradition, for, another side note, the apostolic tradition is the idea that Christianity, in its formalization and becoming formal, created a way so that even as time passed, regardless of the time period we live in, we can say confidently that, like, yes, Jesus did in fact rise from the dead, and because of that, the foundations of the Christian faith and all the teachings of it hold true. This is very important because, once again, the Christianity as a religion, fundamentally, the one thing that ultimately matters in Christianity is, did Jesus rise from the dead? And the coy way I would put it is, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, well, none of the Bible matters. But if he did rise from the dead, then all of it matters, right? And so ultimately, the resurrection was the key doctrine in Christianity. And so the apostolic tradition, using the text, would say, we have witnesses, and we maintain the records of the witnesses to say with confidence that Jesus did rise from the dead. Now, of course, then you get to all the literary critics that talk about, well, how reliable is the New Testament? How reliable is the Bible? And so this is where the New Testament is vastly different from the Old Testament, because the New Testament. Well, let me start with the Old Testament. The problem with the Old Testament, much like any other historical writing, people, I guess, in the ancient world, because once again, it's hard to compare, because in our modern age of technology, it's so easy to preserve literally anything, right? If you remember in my Streaming Parson podcast, I talk about, like, how you can know anything because the internet exists, right? You can know anything. No information is outside of your grasp. You can know basically anything. You can just look it up, study like what the information you need on the internet, and then you can know it, right? You can know basically anything. But that didn't exist in the ancient world, so it was a lot harder to maintain any kind of records that existed in general, right? And of course, you think of, like, an historical event of, like, the Burning of Alexandria, which was a monumental historical event because of how it changed the way that people understood the importance of record keeping. Because, of course, with the Burning of Alexandria began the Dark Ages. Of course, the Dark Ages, when people say the Dark Ages, they refer to, like, a time when literacy was at an all-time low, which is true. But at the same time, just because of that doesn't mean people were at their stupidest at that time period. People were still very, very intelligent in the Dark Ages. But a lot of practical wisdom was lost because a lot of written stuff was lost, right? A lot of writing was lost because when the biggest library in the world was destroyed, that's kind of what happened, right? So a lot of ancient, the ancient world, it was hard to keep records around. That's basically the main point of getting it. And so when you get to the Old Testament, and much like a lot of, you can think of like a lot of Sanskrit writings and like Indian tradition, right? It's very similar because people relied more on memory than actually writing stuff down and keeping like tons of records. A lot of things get mysticized, right? And that was something that obviously happened in the Old Testament. I talk about this when we were talking about the book of Samuel. A lot of stuff gets mysticized in those stories because it was mainly an oral story, and then it was put on the page like hundreds of years way after the fact, right? So when something is written down hundreds of years after the fact, right, like you can embellish all kinds of things into it, right? Because I mean, no one from 100 years, during the actual event could actually do fact checking, right? It's not like in 2022, where fact checking is a very easy thing to do, right? You just click on it and you can fact check literally anything, right? But that wasn't the case in the ancient world. But the New Testament, I guess you could say the Christians were very innovative because they wanted to avoid this. So when it came to writing stuff about Jesus, even though the book of Luke was compiled 40 years after the death of Jesus, technically a lot of the stuff that Luke would have used in his study, which we'll talk about when we read chapter 1. I know we're like 40 minutes in and I still haven't read anything yet. But basically, 40 years later, and Luke is compiling all of his information that he needs to come up with the Gospel of Luke, Christians were writing tons of stuff down. And, literary critics will tell you, like, the New Testament had, like, tens of thousands of manuscripts written about the life of Jesus and his ministry and stuff, right? Tens of thousands, because the church wanted to make sure that they had records and they had enough permanence, right? Because, of course, I guess a theological reason for that was because if Christians were going to make a big deal of, go out and make disciples of all nations kind of thing, right? You better make sure you have, reliable sources of anything you talk about in relations to Jesus, right? And so thousands and thousands of manuscripts were written, which was very interesting that the Christians decided to do this. Because once again, most ancient cultures relied more on oral tradition, right? And in contrast, you think of traditional Hinduisms. Everything is done by memory, right? And the reason why in Hindu belief was because only when you memorize the Sanskrit writings are you actually connected to God. That was kind of, that was when you memorize the Vedas and all the other all the other ancient texts of Hindu culture. Before, once again, this changed when the British showed up way later, but in Hindu belief, that was your assured way of reaching the nirvana states, right? Well, in Hinduism, it's a little different. Her nirvana was a Buddhist version of that, but basically the elevated, enlightened state, which then would let you, merge with Brahma. That was kind of the Hindu belief, and so because that was their belief, writing down their religious texts would have been a no-no, right? Because that would put you further away from God. But in Christianity, the mindset was very different. In Christianity, they believe that, like, no, writing is how that will make sure people can trust what we say, right? And once again, that, in a funny way, that's actually something Christians probably adopt from Greek philosophy and Greek thinking, right? Was that, no, using written documents to back up what we say is going to help us in the long run, which you can make the case that's definitely true, right? Because, we can have, there's millions of Christians today that we all read the same Bible, and we can say, yeah, we all believe the same thing because, well, the written text really helps us out, right? It's really helpful that we have the text, right? And so that was kind of the idea of why Christians created so many manuscripts. And of course, another key thing that made Christianity very different from, you think of a lot of other ancient records, was that you think writing 40 years after Jesus' life is a long time, but in comparison to like other historical figures, like, okay, you think of like let's try and look at other really ancient, figures. Alexander the Great, right? So for those of you who don't know who Alexander the Great is, and I'd be kind of worried if you didn't, Alexander the Great was basically this, I think he's a Median or a Mede. He might be one of the Greek subgroups, and then he kind of formalized what would be, well, Greece. And part of that was, conquering the known world, at least in his time period, and to make Greece a superpower. His way of doing it was basically kicking the shit out of a whole bunch of people, and he was pretty good at it. And so Alexander the Great, he conquered from, well, what is now Greece, all the way up to India, and fighting along all of part of the South Asia, right? And then he eventually reached India before, like, okay, his forces were too thinned out, for fighting for that long, and spreading his influence to that much of the world, right? So that's who Alexander the Great is. But the funny thing is, if you were like to be really skeptical, right, you could say none of that actually happened, because anyone who wrote down any of that stuff I just said about Alexander the Great, the first record of Alexander the Great came roughly 300 years, about 300 years after his death. So all that stuff I just said about him, like, a guy wrote that 300 years later, and for all we know, he could have made that up, right? For all we know, Alexander the Great could have been a fictional person. He could not have been real, right? Because 300 years is a really long time, right? But for Jesus, and to say like 40 years, well, 40 years, people live, people in the ancient world don't live to only 30 years, contrary to popular belief. But like, 40 years, like, how old am I? I'm like 33. So a little like more than my lifespan. But, you take like some of you guys, take like your parents that are like in their 50s, right? Well, let's say you heard about Jesus when you were a kid, right? And Jesus was a person when you were a kid. And then 40 years later, people are still talking about him, right? And you could be like, yeah, I remember hearing about that guy once upon a time, right? And he was a real person. Like, I was alive when he was a thing, right? And so, I talk about this in the Time is Weird video, right? Where, like, I know it's easy to just say, well, stuff doesn't exist outside of my own lifespan. But that's kind of a silly way of looking at life. But, with the 40 years of Jesus' life, people could legitimately do that and say, like, yeah, Jesus was a person, and writing 40 years later, yeah, yeah, I can, that happened because I was around when that happened, right? And so the book of Luke, writing 40 years after Jesus' death, would not have been like a far-fetched thing. Even though compared to us as moderns, like, you can have a guy be on YouTube for 10 years and then cancel him, like, in a month, right? And 10 years is a very short amount of time, right? But for the ancient world, for, the writers to write about Jesus, well, to compile the book of Luke, because once again, they were writing about Jesus much earlier than the 40 years of the book of Luke is put together. The point I'm getting at is the 40-year thing is not really a problem, right? It would not have been a big problem, because, if we doubt Jesus' existence because a guy was writing 40 years after his death, you'd have to doubt basically every single ancient character in history. And even like ones after Jesus' time, right? You think of like people like Genghis Khan, right? Much later than Jesus' time, but all his records don't start showing up till much later than his supposed death period, right? So, Alexander the Great, as I kind of made a joke of like, oh, we could say he was made up because, anything written about him was about 300 years later than his time period, right? And so because of this, and a lot of academics would say like, yeah, Jesus of Nazareth is the litmus test of how we study historical people now, because unlike a lot of other ancient figures, Jesus doesn't have as big a time disparity between his life and stuff written about him, right? Now, of course, I could go into this a little more, but I think because I've already talked about this preface thing long enough and spent like 40 minutes on this, lordy, that's a long time, and we haven't read anything yet. But, you think of like, there were non-Christian writers, like, Josephus is a Jewish philosopher, and he obviously referred to Jesus as being a real person. And of course, the other thing was that the big reference was because his half-brother James was clearly a real person, and Josephus records his death, right? The brother of Jesus. And so obviously that dude clearly existed. And in the Bible, we'll learn that James is like a very important person in the church much later, right? From Book of Luke, right? But basically, the Book of Luke, what I'm trying to get at here, and we could talk about this more as I read through the Book of Luke, is that the Book of Luke is meant to be a reliable document about Jesus, right? And that anything we want to study about Jesus, for the most part, we can actually get a lot of it from the Book of Luke because it is a reliable source. It's not just, Christians putting a lot of bias in their, to promote their religion. The Book of Luke is writing about Jesus in a very, as best as they could anyway, objective way, right? That was a very, very long preface, but I really wanted to hammer some of that like technical information stuff as we jump into the Book of Luke, so that we can take the Book of Luke as an academic read, right? And not just a pastor's reading a book of the Bible, but we are reading the Book of Luke from a very academic lens, and I think that's very important for us to do. I'm just going to take this quick drink break. Let us begin. Luke, chapter 1. Now, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those from the first eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, O excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. Now in the time of Herod, the king of Judah, there was a priest named Zachariah, who belonged to the priestly division of Abia. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. So both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless, because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Sound familiar? Now once when Zachariah's division was on duty, he was serving as priest before God. He was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when the time of the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshippers were praying outside. When an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense, Zachariah saw him. He startled and was gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zachariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. He will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he is born. He will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord, and in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the parents to their children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." Zechariah asked the angel, "How can I be sure of this? For I am an old man, and my wife is well along in years." And the angel said to him, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe the words of my mouth, which will come true at their appointed time." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zachariah and wondering why he stayed so long in the temple. When he came out, he couldn't speak to them. They realized he had seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them, but remained unable to speak. When his time of service was completed, he returned home. After this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant and for 5 months remained in seclusion. The Lord had done this for me, she said. In these days he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace among the people. Verse 26. Now in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. And the angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. But the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever, and his kingdom will never end." "How can this be?" Mary asked the angel, "since I am a virgin?" And the angel answered, "The Holy Spirit will come on you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God. Even Elizabeth, your relative, is going to have a child in her old age, and she who is said to be unable to conceive is in her 6th month. For no word from God will ever fail." "I am the Lord's servant," Mary answered. May your word to me be fulfilled." Then the angel left her. Okay, I can't keep up Mary's voice because she's got this long monologue. So I'll just do her voice. I'll just do a normal voice for her. Because you guys know I suck with women voices. I really need to, like, find someone to really help me with these women voices. Actually, we're going to do a shortcut there because Luke 1 is super long, right? I might not even get through to Luke 3 at this rate. But let's talk about this first chunk, I guess we could say, of Luke chapter 1. So, as I talked about in that whole 40-minute thing, so, here's your TLDR. The book of Luke introduces itself as like, look, I, Luke, have assembled, a lot of this stuff that has been circulating in Christian churches, a lot of the documents and whatever, and I'm going to compile them and make this, like, well-documented tale of Jesus. This well-documented, manuscript that we can use, for church services for who knows how long, right? And so Luke is saying, I've assembled these things, as best as I could, right? So that we can really explain all the cool stuff that's been happening for us. Now, here's a little funny thing that it's weird that I start with the book of Luke, but we're starting from a chronological sense. But similar to like Exodus and Genesis, it is more than safe to assume that the book of Acts may have been written before the book of Luke. And of course, Luke and Acts, some Bible scholars treat it as if they're like really one collection of books, because Luke wrote Acts to record all the stuff that was happening, this explosion of the Christian faith. And then the book of Luke was probably taking all these older documents, putting them together and saying, this is how, everything in Acts came to be, right? Because of all the stuff that happened earlier, right? The prequel. So similar to like Exodus being written first and then Genesis leading up to Exodus was written after. In the same way, you could safely assume the book of Luke may have gone through the same process. And so with that said, the introduction of the book of Luke, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because Luke is saying, look, this this manuscript, the book of Luke, this is going to explain, who Jesus is and why, what he did, which led to everything that's been happening, aka the book of Acts. And so that's another reason why we can safely assume that the book of Luke is roughly written 70 AD-ish, 70, 88 AD-ish, because once again, the book of Acts would have happened, Luke would have written all that down, and then would have wrote Luke as the prequel to it after the book of Acts, which the book of Acts ends, 67 AD supposedly, because the book of Acts ends a couple years before the destruction of Jerusalem, which was in 70 AD. So Luke would have been written sometime after the destruction of the temple, right? Shortly after. But at the same time, Luke is writing that, like, we are faithful to Jesus despite all that because of everything that's happened, which is the whole point of the book of Luke. So that's, the first set of verses that, that's basically what the first set of verses is meant to convey, right? And of course, there's this interesting thing where Luke writes to this Theophilus, which, Greeks had a lot of funny names. But of course, there's also the theory that Theophilus may not be a person. But rather, Luke is using that word, Theophilus, to address Christians. Because of course, if you do basic etymology, it's kind of obvious that could very well be the case. Because Theophilus is basically a compound word, right? Theo meaning God, and Philus is a friend, right? So in a way, Theophilus would mean friend of God, roughly translated, right? And so with that said, when Luke is writing to Theophilus, he may not actually be writing to an individual person. He's writing like a document that would be preserved in Christian tradition, and using the title Theophilus, he's referring to all Christians as friends of God. Which, that makes sense, right? Because, of course, the Christian worldview is that we are connected to God on a relational level because of the death of Jesus, right? Now, let's talk about the next part here, the Zachariah part, and then we'll talk about the Mary part, and then we'll continue. I find the Zachariah story hilarious. I'm just to tell you this now. It's one of the funniest stories in my mind. It's funny because of how bizarre and ridiculous it is. Now, of course, as we've read through the Old Testament, there's a lot of ridiculous stories in the Bible in general. But the book of Zechariah, I just find there's a lot of humor to it, which I think is why it's so great to read. And it's like absurdly humorous, and it's like almost comical of how ridiculous some of this stuff is. Of course, I guess this stories like this is where we get the idea that God does have a good sense of humor, right? Because he comes up with ridiculous stuff like this to happen. So we had this guy, Zachariah, right? And he's like, I guess he must be serving as, not high priest, but he's obviously like a district representative. So I guess the modern equivalency would be like if the high priest was the Pope. I'm going to use the Catholic hierarchy system because it's the one that makes it's an easy parallel. So if the high priest in Jerusalem was the Pope, well, the Pope has a bunch of archbishops that serve next in command after him. Zechariah would have been in that position at this time. And the reason we know this is because he's the one who has to do the temple incense, going to the Holy of Holies, which is, as I've mentioned in the Solomon building story way back, in the Holy of Holies was a place where like archbishop, for the equivalency thing, this just under the high priest position. We'll call them arch priests for now, even though arch and high kind of mean the same thing, but you get the idea. So arch priest Zechariah, since he's able to do this service, going to the Holy of Holies and doing the incense there, he's pretty high up in the chain of command. But of course, what's funny is that basically entering the Holy of Holies, even though it's like this really big responsibility and it's a very important an important task for the Jews to do. At the same time, I'm pretty sure a lot of these guys would not volunteer to do it. Because the Holy of Holies was a very serious ritual that these guys had to do. And it kind of goes down like this. So when the archpriest has to go into the Holy of Holies and do like a sacrifice in there and burn incense and whatever, he has to go in with like, he has to be perfect in the sense of like, he has to be as good possibly gets so that God doesn't obliterate him on sight. Because there was this belief, and you know, there isn't a lot of records whether this actually happened. So, you know, you gotta take this with a grain of salt. But the idea was, if you went into the Holy of Holies and you were not worthy before God, you would die on the spot. And so the tradition was they would actually tie a rope to the guy. They would tie a rope to him. And, you know, the archpriest goes in there. And if he takes too long, you got to tug on the rope a bit and make sure the guy's alive, right? Because if he died in there, because no one else can, like someone else can't enter the Holy of Holies after the priest dies in there, right? So they tie a rope to the guy, and they're like, okay, we're gonna, you know, if he's not doing anything for a while, we're gonna pull on it and see if he's alive, and then if he's not alive, we gotta drag his dead body out, right? So, you know, with a job like that, right? Like, I don't think a lot of these priests would have volunteered, like, yeah, I want to do the Holy of Holies duty, right? I don't think a lot of priests would have been like volunteering for that position, right? Because, you know, if people were self-conscious enough, they would be like, well, we all know we've made mistakes. We all know we're not, you know, we've all done things that make us unworthy before God. So I don't know if I want to go in there, you know, and try and be blameless before God. That sounds like a very tall order. So we know that the priest didn't really want to like do it. No one volunteered, at least, for this, because the Bible points out kind of this weird detail. It's like, yeah, they decided that Zachariah was going to be by lot. Basically, they gambled for the position, which is kind of funny, right? You don't think a bunch of priests gambling. I mean, we made church corruption jokes about it, but like, you know, you don't think a bunch of priests, you know, gambling for like this responsibility, right? They're basically playing a game of chance, but you know, there's the whole chicken or egg thing where it's like, is it chance or is it God's, you know, divine will? And you know, it's a funny mix of both, right? Because you know, we perceive it as chance, but the way that, you know, God just structures it to happen in a sequence of ways, well, God made it that way, but it looks to us like it's by chance, right? And that happens in real life a lot, right? So there's this weird merit, like when I say like by chance, right? I don't mean that like, well, God, in a weird way, God uses luck, but not in the way we understand like luck to be like, oh, completely random, right? If that makes sense. Like luck is not completely random because God uses unconventional means to make things occur. But to us as humans and our perception of reality and time, it looks like it just kind of happened, right? But God made it happen through, you know, the butterfly effect kind of thing, right? So like, you know, the most ridiculous details that like led up to the chance event happening. But since we as people don't perceive every, you know, micro moment, we wouldn't know. But anyway, that's its own crazy philosophical discussion in its own time. But basically, the thing I want to point out here is kind of funny that like the priests get like basically play bets and draw lots, which is like, you know, a chance game basically to decide who's going to go into the Holy of Holies, because none of them clearly wanted to volunteer to do it. And I just find that kind of funny, right? Because, you know, you may get your holier than thou Christians that may say like, well, I would be ready to do anything God said, you know, called me to do. It's like, dude, man, sit back for a second, because that is a tall order. Anything God asks of us is gonna be a tall order. So I don't know if I want to jump in head first immediately. I know some people may call me out and say like, well, you're not being faithful enough, Michael. It's like, no. Like if God was calling me to do something, it's never easy. The way I look at it, you know, and I know some people may think I have a little more cynical view on this, but I would say like, look, if doing ministry for God wasn't scary, then you're not doing it right. That's how I think of it. I think like if I'm doing ministry for God, if it's not scary, you're not doing it right. Now you may think, well, you're doing this on YouTube. It's like, Like, you think this is scary? Like, to an extent, it is scary, right? Because, in the internet age, anything I say could get me in trouble, right? But what's more important to me is, proclaiming the gospel as truth, right? And I don't care if I run into obstacles about it. Yes, that's scary, but at the same time, the truth of the gospel is more important to me, right? And so that's why. So on the one hand, it's like, okay, there is a bit of that fear element, but at the same time, we also, as a Christian, I also believe that, like, well, God is with me as I do this endeavor. So even though it's scary, I can, in my weakness, Christ's strength is complete. And so it doesn't matter that it can be scary to preach the gospel on YouTube, for example, right? And I'm not the only one who thinks this, right? There's tons of people who, have their Bible related videos and talk Christian theology on YouTube, and they all probably think the same thing. If you ask them, they'll tell you the same thing. But basically, my philosophy behind it is, if the prospect of doing the ministry of God isn't scary, you're not doing it right. And the book of Zachariah is a good reminder of that, right? Like, if doing the service of God isn't scary, you're not doing it right. And clearly, these guys understood that. That's why they decided to leave it to a game of chance of who was going to go into the Holy of Holies, which I find that actually kind of funny. But don't worry, the humor doesn't end there. Because we move along, and of course, there's the encounter with the angel. Now, this is an interesting event because, if you watch my Old Testament videos, more often than not, the angel that often appears is usually unnamed, and most scholars interpret it to be like it was actually Jesus himself that would appear as these angels in the Old Testament. And that's why you get these funny phrases where, like, in the book of Judges, for instance, I think it's Samson's parents who, like, they encounter an angel, but this angel isn't just an angel, right? Because they see this angel, they talk to him, and then the angel, tells them about they're gonna have Samson in the future and all that. And then after he does this, like, wicked ass miracle, like, Samson's parents nearly shit themselves because they're like, we've seen the face of God and yet we live, right? And so, funny moments like that. They're like, oh, we've seen the face of God and yet we live, right? But in this story in Luke is different because this angel gives himself a name and he differentiates himself from God. Like, he's clearly not God. Which is interesting because this is one of the few times in the entirety of the Bible this actually happens. Most angels in the Bible are never named and are never depicted in this way. Quite a few angels in the New Testament, well, the few angels that are in the New Testament do behave this way. But if you read in the Old Testament is never like this. And it's very interesting that the New Testament does this complete different turn of attitude toward angels. Of course, there's, literary critics talking about, like, how the evolution of angelology and demonology was a thing in late, like, basically, once again, this goes back to the late book of Ezra and Nehemiah time period. The evolution of angelology really changed how, what was the purpose of angels and all that stuff in Jewish theology, and which obviously transferred over to Christian theology as well. And, I talk about this quite a bit in the Exodus story, and where many people made this mythological character of, like, the angel of death, but then, like, you actually read the Bible and it's clearly not the case, where, like, God himself becomes the Grim Reaper, right? Yes! 2022, and we already get to start strong with that reference, because anytime I make that reference, every time I make that, I'm always happy. Just so you know. I guess because I have a very dark sense of humor. I'm terrible, aren't I, right? Hashtag terrible pastor. Where is that? Did I not put it in the description? Wow, bad. Anyway, but going back to Zechariah and this angel, Gabriel, the angel differentiates himself from God. He's clearly not God. But then at the same time, he says, like, he talks a big deal, because he's like, when Zechariah doubts him, and then Gabriel's like, yo, because you doubted the words from my mouth, you're gonna have this mini curse for a while, right? You can't speak until this child is born. And I always thought, it was one of those things where, like, you kind of skim over the story where like, okay, Zachariah is now mute until his son is born. But if you actually read in between the lines, this is actually got to be like one of the funniest stories, right? Because first of all, he has to leave the Holy of Holies, and as the Bible mentioned a little bit earlier, while the archpriest is going into the Holy of Holies, a whole bunch of other people, other priests, other devoted believers and all that, they would all be outside praying, saying like, oh God, give us a vision, like what's the archpriest gonna say after he goes into the Holy of Holies? We wanna know if he's got like a message from God, right? We wanna hear that, right? They're all getting excited for it. And then this dude walks out, he can't say a damn thing, right? And he's like making like hand gestures, trying to do sign language on the fly, even though never doing it once in his life. Who knows what Zachariah had to do, right? And it's pretty funny. We're like, okay, how did that go down, right? And we can kind of paint these we can try to imagine what that would be like, right? Like Zachariah has a walkout, and tradition would say like, okay, you're gonna speak what revelation God gave you, and then you have this guy and he can't say a single thing, right? And it's probably like hilarious how that went down. Because that would be something I'd want to see. Because I think that's funny. And how much of a bumbling idiot he must have looked, right, when he couldn't say anything. Of course, one of the other funny things too, I think there's actually a significance, minus the humor, of why the punishment for him doubting would be to not be able to speak. Out of all things, right? Well, one, I mentioned earlier, where like the fundamental of their religious culture was all oral tradition, right? And so if Zachariah is an archpriest, then one of his fundamental duties is to, retell Torah stories, retell, the book of the law, via oral tradition. Now he can't do that, right? Which automatically disqualifies him as being archpriest, right? And so that's kind of one of the funny. I think that's a pretty important aspect of that. Why the punishment is the silence. And secondly, I think there's an ironic thing, because once again, the Bible is full of these ironic moments. And I think irony is just a funny way of making a point in literature. And that's true of any literature. The Bible does it a lot, obviously. But the Bible isn't the only text that does this, right? I always make the joke of, if your name is Agatha, you're going to be a witch, which is ironic, because Agatha it's from the Greek word hagios, and hagios is the word for a saint. So the irony is that the woman named Saint, Agatha, becomes a witch, right? The practitioner of the dark arts. And so obviously that's supposed to be ironic, right? In the same way, the Bible does this a lot too. And so the irony of Zachariah not being able to speak is that his whole shtick is that he speaks for God when he recites the Torah, when he retells the book of the law. He represents God with his words. But now he can't do that. And so I think there's obviously that very important there's that important irony behind that. And obviously it's intended to be ironic for that reason. To show that like how far the tradition of Judaism had fallen, I think, is kind of what the story is actually kind of getting to on an in between the lines kind of thing, right? Because why would the silence be a big deal if you read it from like just reading through the text? Why silence of all things? Because Zachariah is supposed to be representing God with his words, but clearly he himself doubts God in his whole when he questions the angel, well, how can Elizabeth and I have kids? We're a bunch of old farts. So he's doubting here. And then, of course, because he doubts, and that's the words that come out of his mouth, then he is disqualified from being, what he's supposed to be. Someone who's faithful, someone who shows the power of God through words. But yet he doubts the power of God. And, I kind of made a little coy comment about, like, does this look familiar to old farts, having a kid in their old age? I mean, doesn't in the book of Genesis, this happens multiple times, right? Because, of course, the thematic thing is that, God can make the impossible possible. And and using old people to have kids is a big deal. Now, before we actually talk about Mary, I want to throw in this joke because you cannot possibly talk about this story and not talk about the elephant in the room. So, one of the important things when we get to the Mary passage, and I'll kind of point this out now because it works for the Zachariah joke that I have to talk about. Because let's be real, you're on a streaming Parson stream, and you know we're going the dark directions here because dark sense of humor is my jam. So when Mary is approached by Gabriel later, Mary questions the angel, and she asks how she's able to have a kid when she's a virgin. Of course, in the Christian creeds, the fact that Jesus is born from Mary as a virgin is a very big deal. Because, of course, this fulfills, a lot of Old Testament prophecies about, the virgin will have a son, and that son will be the deliverer of humanity. The book of Daniel has it, the book of Ezekiel has it, Isaiah has it, this idea of like this virgin birth. And this virgin birth, unlike any other, will bring forth the deliverer, which is where we later get the concept of Messiah. The deliverer of humanity will come from. He'll come from this virgin birth. And so the Bible goes out of its way to talk about how Jesus is the only one really that's born from a virgin birth. And this is where you get back to the whole old people, and it's kind of like the Bible, like when the Bible writers came out with this, did they actually think people would think this hard and make weird jokes out of this? Because, I mean, yours truly is going to go down that dark path, and I will go into this joke because I'm a terrible human being. But, with all these older people that don't, they don't have kids yet, and then they're told they're going to have kids. But remember, the Bible goes out of its way to say that only Mary had the virgin birth, which means you get to these old guys, and now you're going to go like, oh God, Michael, this is so cringy. Why are you doing this to us? But like, yeah, old ass Zachariah, just like with Abraham, had to have sex with their old ass wives. But the funny part with Zachariah, unlike with Abraham, I mean, Abraham was already hilarious of the story as it was back in Genesis, right? Old ass Abraham had to have sex with his old ass wife, and I wonder how that sex talk went down, right? Like, how did that sex talk go down? Talk about like, yeah, like two elderly people just chit chat about like, God said we're gonna have a kid, so we better get to business, right? But of course, what adds to the joke is that Zachariah can't speak. So how did he communicate this to Liz? Like, did he just walk in one day? Like, maybe after, like, he goes home that day, and Liz is probably, like, doing old lady things, crocheting or something. And what does Zachariah do? Like, just walk in with only his sandals on? Like, how's he supposed to communicate that they're going to have sex and have a kid in their old age? He can't speak. And so you're like, how did that happen, right? And of course, like, this is where some people may think, like, oh, obviously, this is where some people may think, oh, the story's made up because this is too ridiculous, right? This story is way too ridiculous. How would that happen, right? But, I mean, on the one hand, crazier things in real life have happened. And secondly, I mean, does love need words? Sorry, I went there, but, does love need words? I'm sure, Liz would have got the message if he just walked in on her naked with a smile on his face. I had to do it, I'm sorry. But when you read this story, how could you not think that? See, I made you unsee it, right? Now you can't unsee it. Every time you read this passage, you're going to think that. And you will have me to thank for that. So yeah. Now that's something that's going to scar your minds for a while, how old-ass Zechariah is supposed to convince his old-ass wife, Elizabeth, that they're going to have sex without speaking. And if you really want to take a much more grosser turn on the joke, was he allowed to at least make grunting noises? Makes you wonder. Only if you're a sicko like me, I guess. Not if you were thinking that, but now you can't unthink it, because I made you think it. Alright, moving on to the last part, before we have to continue on, because maybe I won't be able to cover chapter 3 at this rate. But that's okay. Reading chapter 1 and chapter 2 is more than enough. So we get to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth is visited by the angel, and she's told that she's gonna have a son. His name's Jesus. You know, we already went through this with Joseph later, and then of course the Matthew account The Matthew account starts after this part, where after the angel visits Mary. If you remember the Matthew account, which I read for Christmas, the story begins with Joseph, and Joseph is all like, "Oh God, like, what do I do? You know, the woman I'm engaged to is pregnant with a kid that's clearly not mine. Should I just like divorce her quietly and, you know, send her away? You know, I don't want to make a big scene out of it." And then so Joseph's kind of like, "What do I do?" Right? And he's broken up about it until the angel tells him, "No, you know, take Mary as your wife. You know, this kid is from God and all that." But here in the book of Luke, we have when the angel visits Mary first before the angel visits Joseph. And the angel visits her, and you know she has the clear objection. Well, how is this possible? I'm a virgin. I haven't had sex with anyone yet. And the angel tells her, well, the spirit of God will be upon you, and so it will just happen. The Bible leaves no room for like, well, you could throw in a scientific explanation, but then you run into other things too, like why did she have more kids by herself basically after? But I mean, considering how many kids she had, I mean, you can't rule out the possibility. But once again, you know, the whole Jesus being born this way, it's meant to show that, you know, Jesus fulfills Bible prophecy, right? And once again, that's why, you know, Jesus has the Bible goes out of its way to talk about Jesus being born from Mary when she was a virgin. Of course, contrary to some Catholic doctrine of the Immaculate Virginity, which the Immaculate Virginity is the idea that even after she gave birth to Jesus, she remained a virgin, which makes no sense. And I don't know why any Catholic would think that, because one of the pillars of the church, you know, James, the half brother of Jesus, you know, Mary obviously had sex to have that kid. So yeah, that kind of falls apart real quick. But anyway, Mary is told that she's gonna have the kid, and I made this joke during the Christmas videos about how yes, Mary did know, unlike the pentatonic song, because this passage tells us that like the angel just flat out told her that yeah, she's gonna be holding, you know, the Son of God. And so, and then what's interesting here, the real takeaway that I want to focus on here, now that we've done through all the more trivial, humorous stuff, is the contrast between Mary and Zachariah when Gabriel tells them that they're going to have children through like ridiculous means, right? So with Zachariah through two old people having sex, and Mary through a virgin birth. Now, of course, if you actually think about it, the virgin birth is way more ridiculous than two old people getting it on. There's all the medical reasons why two elderly people couldn't have a kid, but that, you know, there's also all the medical reasons why a virgin couldn't have a kid. And, you know, we always make those jokes about like how dumb people are when they think that kissing alone gets them pregnant or something. You know, like those silly like TV dramas, right? But basically, we get to the contrast of Zachariah and Mary is that like Zachariah, he doubts it. He's like, well, this is ridiculous, right? This isn't gonna happen. We've tried we've tried having kids for years, and clearly it didn't work. And so what makes today any different is kind of Zachariah's attitude. Mary's attitude, on the other hand, is I'm a faithful servant, and you know what you say will be done, which is interesting because you know she kind of says to Gabriel the kind of things that people would say to God himself, right? What you say will be done. So that's kind of an interesting thing that happens there too, as you read this passage. But Mary's attitude is very different. And that's kind of the real takeaway from this section of Luke 1, is that, you know, this is what makes Mary such an important person in the Christian faith, right? She's a very important person because she shows this like incredible level of faithfulness that many Christians ought to emulate. Though, to be fair, a lot of us, honestly, I mean, if I were honest, I'd be similar to Zachariah, right? And most of us would be when we think that, like, when God tells us something, that some, he's going to do something in our lives. We're more of us are more likely to be like Zachariah, to kind of be to like doubt and question, like in a cynical way. And that's one of the harsh realities of life, is that, like, well, life will quickly jade us. And I've mentioned before that I'm no stranger to that. I'm no stranger to that in my own life, and I'm sure many people probably feel similar things in their own life. And it's easier for us to doubt like Zechariah does. But Mary's faithfulness is something to be emulated, and she's kind of seen as this like heroic, this person of heroic faith, because she believes, and she doesn't. She believes and doesn't like quickly shut down the possibility. Just get rid of that. More spam. Lovely. Anyway, that's a lot to talk about with this first part of the chapter. So I don't really want to say much else. I mean, I've kind of expounded on that enough. But I mean, there is so much more that can be said about this sequence of events, and of course you would have to go to the Matthew event and see some like parallels too, right? Between the Matthew and the Luke account, and how Mary and then Joseph in the Matthew account really take that Jesus, the Messiah is coming through Mary, and so that's a big deal. But I think I've talked about that enough, and we're already an hour and a half in, and we're only halfway through chapter 1. Yikes! A lot slower than I thought I'd be, but there's a lot to cover, and I think a lot of Luke chapters will be like this. So it's very possible, like, the book of Luke will take us for a couple months, right? And, I mean, it's better that way anyway, that we can study this a lot more in depth. But let's continue on with verse 39 of chapter 1. So at that time, Mary got ready and hurried to a town in the hill country of Judea, where she entered Zachariah's home and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the baby leapt in her womb. And Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. In a loud voice she exclaimed, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child you will bear. But why am I so favored that the mother of my Lord would come to me? As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leapt for joy. For blessed is she who has believed that the Lord would fulfill his promise to her." And Mary said, and I'm totally doing this in a normal voice, "My soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has been mindful of the humble state of his servant. From now on, all generations will call me blessed, for the Mighty One has done great things for me. Holy is his name. His mercy extends to those who fear him from generation to generation. He has performed mighty deeds with his arm. He has scattered those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. He has brought down rulers from their thrones and has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but has sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel, remembering to be merciful to Abraham and his descendants forever, just as he promised our ancestors." So Mary stayed with Elizabeth for about 3 months and then returned home. When it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father, Zachariah. But his mother spoke up and said, "No, he is to be called John." And they said to her, "But there's no one in your relatives who has that name." Then they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. He motioned for a writing tablet, And to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, "His name is John." Immediately his mouth was opened, and his tongue set free, and he began to speak, praising God. All the neighbors were filled with awe, and throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about all these things. Everyone who heard this wondered about it, asking, "What then is this child going to be? For the Lord's hand is clearly with him." So John's father Zachariah was filled with the Holy Spirit and prophesied, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come to his people and redeemed them. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he said through his holy prophets of long ago, salvation from our enemies and from the land of all who hate us, to show mercy to our ancestors and to remember his holy covenant, the oath he swore to our father Abraham, to rescue us from the hand of enemies, to enable us to serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness before him all our days. And you, my child, will be called a prophet of the Most High, for you will go on before the Lord to prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation, to the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace." And the child grew and became strong in spirit, and he lived in the wilderness until he appeared publicly to Israel. So yeah, chapter 1 was really long. But the second part, we're just gonna kind of skim through it. So basically, we have Mary visits Elizabeth, and they kind of have, some girl talk, I guess. And it's kind of funny, right? Because Elizabeth is like super old, and Mary's, super young, but yet they're cousins apparently. And they have this nice little chit chat, and it's interesting how Mary points out, or sorry, not Mary, Elizabeth points out how, the baby leapt for joy, kind of thing. I guess the baby kicking aggressively or something. However, you want to interpret that when Mary shows up, right? It's very interesting that, like, it's the preborn baby that is the first person to recognize Jesus. I think it's really, really profound. And it shows that, like, it doesn't really take a lot, right? I mean, what does a preborn baby know, right? Basically nothing. But yet, it basically a, a baby that knows nothing is the first to recognize God. I think is incredibly profound, right? Because here we are in the 21st century, and if a baby can acknowledge, if a baby who knows nothing, it can acknowledge God, then there's no reason, despite whatever happens in our lifetime, no matter your past, that you can't recognize God and believe in him, right? There's no reason for that, because I mean, if a baby that knows nothing and has nothing to go off of can recognize God, then all of us can. And I think that's something really profound. Oh, sorry, running water above us. I'm just gonna pause this for a second or mute the mic. Oh, what? I thought I muted the mic. What the heck? Okay, the running water noise is gone. Okay. VPAD says 2 weeks. Hyssop, washing feet, temples, and forehead 3 times a day. A test run on the instructions of Jesus. And there's a lot of other things too. But sure, if that's how you want to start. Anyway, so as I was saying, if a baby with basically nothing to go off of, no life experience or whatsoever, can recognize God, there's really no reason that we couldn't, right, encounter and know God. And I think that's really profound. I think that's one of the interesting things about this encounter between Mary and Elizabeth, which really is more about John and Jesus more than it is about Mary and Elizabeth, even though they're only those two have actually talking dialogue. But I think there is that little nice touch to the story with John the Baptist, recognizing Jesus that early. Then we get to another kind of back to the humorous part of the story, because I'm going to skip the whole Mary song thing, just for time purposes, really. But then we get back to the birth. We get to the birth of John, right? And now Zachariah is back in the story, right? And this whole 9 months time, he hasn't been able to say a damn thing, right? Because the whole you will be stricken with muteness until the child is born, and then he had to write down that the kid's name was going to be John. And I love the original objection of like, wait, why would you name the kid John? No one in your family has that name, because funny Jewish naming conventions of everybody is just Junior. Junior. There's always a junior in the family. You always have, if you have multiple kids, there has to be at least one junior. If you have the one kid, he's got to be junior. Always got to have junior, right? Because the way people transmit names was very different in the ancient world, right? Like in our day and age, we just do surnames, and even then, like surnames are not like a real way of cementing like your, who you are in your lineage. But in the ancient world, they were very serious and strict about that, right? So you always had to have a junior. So of course, the first name pick would have been, his name will be Zachariah Jr. Because what else would you name the only kid you're probably ever gonna have? But Zachariah's like, no, his name is John. And I think that's kind of funny. And then, of course, Zachariah's able to start speaking again, and that's kind of its own funny thing too, right? Where like 9 months this guy had to go without speaking, right? I remember like in the manga version of the Bible, there was a Bible manga, and there was a whole joke when Mary like sees Zachariah. And Elizabeth is kind of like teasing him a little bit, and all he does is nod, right? And Mary's like, why can't this guy, like, why doesn't he say anything? Because he can't speak, right? And then here we have, where after the words of the angel are fulfilled, Zachariah, is able to speak again. And I mean, he has this whole long prophecy thing, but to be fair, I mean, he's got to make up for 9 months of not speaking. So yeah, Zachariah's got a lot to say, and he talks about how like, the beginning of the new age is coming is basically what the prophecy is about. He said that the new age is coming because some of it might have to do with the whole Book of Daniel thing, which I talked about that during the Christmas stream, so I don't want to go too much into that today. But basically, there could be some of that in there, and as well as the miracles that start happening. Because once again, if you read through, as I mentioned earlier, there was this whole like 400 years that's kind of left out of the Bible, and the reason, the theological reason of why, Bible compilers didn't put, some of the history books in between was because there was no miracle from God kind of thing happening. And so in a way you could look at it was that there was like a 400-year drought of miracles from God. That's kind of the popular way of interpreting why there's this 400-year gap between the Old and the New Testament. Of course, the word testament itself means like covenant between God and man. So the 400 years of silence, if you will, well, there was no covenant, which I know that sounds really morbid, but basically God was like, he ditched the covenant, for lack of better words. I know that sounds semi-heretical, but you just gotta roll with it. But I think this wording from Zechariah, he's prophesying that like things are things are going to change, and God didn't ditch the covenant, and we are to be prepared for what God is going to do next. So in a way, my morbid view kind of works here, but Zachariah is proclaiming here that like God hasn't ditched us. He didn't ditch the covenant, and he's not ditching the covenant anymore, and he's going to do something new, and something awesome is going to happen. We don't know what that is yet, but it's going to happen. And Zechariah then says, in the last part of his prophecy, is that he knows his son, John, is going to be part of that. Which then, foreshadows John being, well, John the Baptist. But I think that's kind of the cool thing that the book of Luke really starts off the story with, right? This whole, telling of the gospel, the point of it is to basically say that the age of the church began even before the church was formally established, because God was now on the move, and God was going to do something awesome. Of course, you have to read through the book of Luke to find out what that is. Of course, spoilers for a 2,000-year-old book, but it's through the resurrection of Jesus. But basically, sorry, I got distracted by your message there, VPAT. But basically, there's this, after this drought of miracles and drought from God, or God ditching the covenant kind of thing going on for 400 years, something new was going to happen. And now, this Luke 1 does this whole hype. Here's the hype, right? We're going to hype up the rest of the book of Luke, because you're going to read the rest of the book of Luke to find out what awesome thing God is going to do. VPAS says salt, water, and hyssop, the day one instructions. Brain health wise, raising your natural abilities to think clearly. What is the baptism? The promise to get clean? That depends on what we... Well, the baptism is a pretty loaded term, right? Because on the one hand, the baptism itself is a spiritual process, right? It's the accepting Jesus as our Savior. We are then cleansed from our sin. So in a sense, that's a baptism. When you talk about like the formality of a church doing baptisms, the dipping people in the water thing, that is a formality, right? Because once again, you're in a way, you're already spiritually baptized by receiving Jesus and accepting his gift of forgiveness to be cleansed of sin. So in a sense, you're already baptized in that sense. But when the church formal address of baptism is a public declaration to say, like, I'm a Christian, I believe, yada, yada, yada. So the promise to get clean, I wouldn't put it that way. It's the claim, it's the declaration of saying that, like, I have been cleansed by God, and I'm showing you that I truly believe that. That's the point of baptism. That's what the Bible says. That's what it is. The promise to get clean. The beginning of getting clean. Grave in mercy enacted by stepping forward as you are. Yeah. And then grace and mercy. Yeah. But the idea is that it's more the public See, you're talking about the spiritual aspect of it, which is the first part I mentioned, right? The spiritual aspect of... I'm looking at more of like, it's the gift from God that we have been cleansed, right? And so the desire to be clean, and then God's promise to cleanse us, I think is a more accurate way of putting it. The promise to get clean is more of God's promise to cleanse us. And this is where, a lot of the New Testament books talk about, like, how do I put it? God is faithful in his forgiveness, right? Many Christians use that lingo. God is faithful in his forgiveness, right? And so when we receive Jesus, then we are spiritually cleansed in that sense. And so as we are spiritual, we can be assured that we're spiritually cleansed because God promises that, and he carries that out. And that's what Christians mean when they say, like, well, God is faithful in his promises. Because then when, the idea is that, okay, I believe in Jesus, therefore I know I'm cleansed of sin. right? And then therefore a spiritual baptism happens, and then the water part is just a formality of the symbolisms of it. I think that's what you meant when you said all synergistic aspects, all at once. I mean, there's a symbolic part too, right? The dipping of water, dipping of people in the water is a symbolic thing, and of course there's a whole there's the whole metaphorical symbolism of water baptism in itself, which is its own long thing. But for the sake of me wanting to keep doing this, and I already spent a lot of time talking about other stuff earlier, so I want to be conscious of time, and I want to at least get chapter 2 done because we're already at 4:40. But Jesus did actually teach to actually take herbs and wash feet. Well, the wash feet part for sure. Take herbs thing was just more of like a practical thing because Jesus was a practical person. Okay, like on the one hand, like yes, Jesus obviously did miracles through like supernatural means, but on the other hand, he also like did a lot of things through natural means as well, right? And of course, there's the whole thing about spiritual aspects behind natural means as well. Communion is the embodiment of that, right? It's turning regular things like eating and drinking into a very spiritual practice, right? And so Jesus obviously did the same thing with regular everyday stuff, right? The way I look at it is that in an ironic sense, no, I'm not leaving yet, VPAD. I just want to actually, so if you read in the description, I said I'd read through chapter 1 to 3. I'm going to tell you now, I'm not going to get through chapter 3. But I want to try and get through chapter 2, so we're going to read chapter 2 pretty soon. I just finished reading through chapter 1, if, as you came in. But yeah, definitely love to have the sub, and thanks for coming. Always nice to have people come hang out in these Bible study kind of streams. But yeah, Jesus did actually teach to use herbs and wash feet. Well, the washing feet, once again, half of it is like using the communion analogy again. It was taking things that people would ordinarily do and then adding this kind of spiritual element to remind us that like everything you do has spiritual significance. Going back to the baptism is a good example, right? See, now I have to talk about it because I brought it up. But the symbolism of baptism in water, right? And of course, obviously, this was the whole thing John the Baptist was going off of, right? And so water in mythology in general was a symbol of chaos because water is fluid. Water kind of, just does whatever, right? It just moves with them. It just does motions, right? That's what water does. You see this in like the creation story, right? On day 2, God separates the waters from the matter. And then he, from that, creates orderly matter. So the idea behind that in the creation story in Genesis is that water represented chaos, and then God separated the chaos into order, and then he creates matter through order. That's the metaphor of day 2 is basically what's going on. It's not a literal water and rocks, but rather God separates the chaos and order, and then he creates the ordered universe. So, with water being the symbol of chaos, well, when people dip into the water, well, it's the idea that you were birthed in chaos, and of course, there's the medical and the maternal analogies as well, right? When children are born and water in the woman's womb and everything, right? There's this symbol of chaos that water represents. And so when we were baptized in water, the symbol is that like we were in chaos, right? And sin is another part of that chaos. We are in chaos, and then we come out of chaos, right? And then we can live. That's kind of another metaphor of the baptism thing, right? And so when it comes to like, as you said, Jesus talked about using herbs and washing feet. Well, it was this adding the spiritual element to things that people did every day, right? And it was a reminder that everything you and I do has spiritual significance. So that's kind of one of the themes of this channel that I do, right? Is I play games on the channel, but I try to use it as time to like talk about religious themes in games, and also to connect with people, right? And talk about the Christian faith in doing ordinary people things, right? And so that's kind of the idea I'm going for with the whole Streaming Parson channel. That's kind of the whole point of this. And so to add that spiritual element. And so, you know, you're not wrong in that assertion. But anyway, back to the reading part, because I know I sidetracked it there to talk to you for a bit, but you know, I appreciate you coming and hanging out. Excuse me. Ooh, burp. I appreciate you coming out and hanging out. So it's always great to do a little bit of sidetrack, but at the same time, I also want to get back to the timetable, because otherwise we'd be here forever, right? So yeah, just to do a TLDR of chapter 1. The TLDR is, there was a silence from God, a drought of miracles, if you will. But then with one ridiculous birth in chapter 1, we're going to get to the second one pretty soon. The absurdity of John the Baptist's birth, you know, 2 elderly people have to get it on without words. And you know that joke's never going to get old with me, despite, you know, Zachariah and Elizabeth being old. Ha ha! But, you know, that's never going to get old with me. The idea is that, you know, using such an absurd way to have a miracle happen, Luke is setting up the rest of the book of Luke to say, like, God is going to do something big. Of course, you know, the irony of, if, you know, reading it us reading it in a vacuum kind of right now, that's how the story's supposed to be portrayed, right? Like, you're kind of getting the suspense moment. But at the same time, you know, to the original audience of the book of Luke, they obviously know what's going to happen, because once again, as I mentioned earlier, the book of Luke most likely was written after the book of Acts. And book of Acts happens later in a chronological sense. But of course, once again, the purpose of the book of Luke is assembling all the manuscripts that would be used for churches in the future. And, you know, all the church, you know, these different churches that we'll encounter in the book of Acts when we get there eventually. The book of Acts, obviously, all the churches in the book of Acts would have known. They already know. And so by Luke telling the story, once again, I think there's that element of, like, the book of Luke takes that attitude, as I mentioned earlier, that, like, there's that reality hit too, that since all the original disciples of Jesus are going to be dead pretty soon at this point when the book of Luke was written, the suspense thing works because that's how you introduce new people and new believers to Jesus. And I think that's kind of a really cool literary ability that Luke utilizes in writing the book of Luke, despite the fact it's actually a prequel to his first work, the book of Acts. A rainbow circle. What light does to water sprinkling? Well, this rainbow thing here is just this funny shirt I have. But anyway, let's move on to chapter 2, because we've done chapter 1, and we're going to stop after chapter 2 because I've already been at this for 2 hours, and 2 hours for one chapter. Oh boy. Don't worry. Later books will not be as crazy. And to be fair, I think it's only like an hour of reading Luke 1, because technically the first hour I spent talking about, like, the historiosity of the book of Luke. I had to think about that word for a second. But let's just read Luke 2, and I know it's going to be kind of weird, but, like, Luke 2, we're reading essentially the Christmas story again. But anyway, we're just going to read through Luke 2. Even though it's the Christmas story, we're going to read through it, talk a little bit about it, and then we'll end the stream from there. Eden, water from the earth, a mist. Well, it's a bunch of other things too, but go watch my Genesis video if you want to learn a little bit more about that. Shameless self-promotion. Anyway, chapter 2, the birth of Jesus. So in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while, how the hell I always hate pronouncing some of these names. Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. So he went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloth and placed him in a manger, because there was no guest room available for them. And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all people. For today," I didn't do a voice from the angel. "Today in the town of David a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah. He is the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." Suddenly a great company of heavenly hosts appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace to those on whom his favor rests." So when the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about." So they hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby, who was lying in the manger. When they had seen him, they spread the word concerning what had been told to them about this child, and all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. But Mary treasured up these things and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things they had heard and seen, which were just as they had been told. And on the 8th day, when it was time to circumcise the child, he was named Jesus, the name of the angel had given him before he was conceived. Verse 22. So when the time came for the purification rites required by the law of Moses, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice in keeping with what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons. Now there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon, who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was on him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what the custom of the law required. Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel." The child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him. Then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother, oh man, maybe I shouldn't have done such a hard voice at this guy. I didn't know there was this many more lines. I forgot that there was this many lines this guy had. I thought he only had the one. "This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too." Now there was also a prophetess, Hannah, the daughter of Peniel, of the tribe of Asher. She was very old and had lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage, and then was a widow until she was 84. She never left the temple, but worshipped night and day, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Israel. When Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee to their own town of Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. Verse 41. Now every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. When he was 12, they went up to the festival, according to the custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "But why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they didn't understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. All right, that's the end of chapter 2, but there's a lot in chapter 2. Boy, howdy. Because we got like 3 stories in chapter 2, so we got to go through all of them. Now, the first one I'm not going to go into much detail because, Christmas story. You've probably heard this like hundreds of times. Well, maybe not hundreds of times, but you get the idea. You've heard it pretty frequently. But I'll kind of do a little exposition of what's going on in this scene. So first we have, Roman custom, right? Just a reminder, like, oh yeah, doing things the Roman way. And it starts with this registry, right? And it's interesting that they bring, the reason why they bring up the registry is because, of course, to fulfill biblical prophecy. Because Jesus was to be born in Bethlehem. If you read in the Matthew account, that is how the wise men from the east, most likely Iraqis, were able to find Jesus, right? Because in the book of Matthew, the book of Matthew and the wise men story takes place a couple of years after Jesus is born. So you could say roughly the wise men story takes place somewhere in between verse 40 and verse 41, right? Because verse 40 is when Jesus is like 40 days old, and verse 41 is when he's 12. So the book of Matthew story has the wise men searching for when he's about like 2 years old. And of course, there's the whole thing when Herod kills a whole bunch of, babies. And he used the 2-year line because that was the approximation, right? Where the Magi tell Herod that they've been looking for him for 2 years. And so there was that. But the reason I bring out the Matthew account is because, once again, they knew where to look for Jesus. And the Luke account, with having Joseph return to Bethlehem to register as a Roman citizen, or not Roman citizen, but to be part of the Roman census, it's completely different. To be counted in the Roman census, Joseph he returns to Bethlehem, and then so Jesus is born there, fulfilling, the Messiah is to be born in Bethlehem, as in the book of Micah, that the teachers of the law, Herod's teachers anyways, would have used to find where Jesus was. And so the book of Luke, just reaffirms that part of the Matthew story, that like, yeah, of course, like, Jesus would have been born in Bethlehem because to fulfill Bible prophecy. But unlike in the Matthew account skips 2 years to have the Iraqi travelers. Here, we just have some local shepherds, right? Now, of course, the shepherds thing is important for another reason, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But the popular thing that comes up at a lot of Christmas services is the idea that like, well, God sends angels to notify like a bunch of nobodies, right? Because the shepherds would have just been like a bunch of dudes, right? Just a bunch of guys kind of doing a job, not the best job, because being it's kind of one of those ironic things, right? Being a shepherd was important to society and the religious practices of their society, but at the same time, being a shepherd, you're kind of like the bottom of the bucket and of like popularity. It's kind of like I always make the joke of like a shepherd was kind of equivalent to like a McDonald's worker, right? Like fast food is an important part of like American society and Canadian society. Basically, any developed country, right? Whether you're in U.S., Canada, the U.K., fast food is an essential part of your society. Not even just fast food, but like any the food industry. But not like when I say food industry, I'm not talking about like high end restaurants. Like the shepherd, I wouldn't equate like a shepherd to a high end restaurant employee, but like like a regular takeout place or you know yeah, takeout. So it doesn't have to just be like fast food, but like, for example, like, for dinner in a little bit, I'm gonna go get some takeout sushi, right? But like a takeout employee, right? They're not high end in our society, but at the same time, our society, especially with like, COVID and all that, like takeout is like an essential part of our society. But at the same time, we don't view our takeout employees as like, oh, they're the echelon of society. To be a takeout employee is to be like one of the highly uh, favored positions. People don't people don't think you're awesome because you work as takeout, right? It's kind of one of those ironic things about it. So I kind of equate the shepherd to that in some way. So for us modern people, if you're trying to imagine what a life of a shepherd would have been like, think of like a takeout restaurant employee, right? You're important to society, but half the time no one gives a shit about you. That's kind of the unfortunate truth, right? But no. But in all seriousness, I do respect you take out employees because once again, you're kind of important to our society, and we appreciate you for who you are. But at the same time, that's kind of what the shepherd life was like, right? So, with that being said, going back to the angels appearing to them, it's kind of cool because like God shows up to the every person, and that's the important thing about the takeout employee equivalency, right? Is that they're the every person. They're just regular people doing what they need to do to survive. Do they're not the greatest paying, but hey, you got a job's a job, right? And these guys are working to get some sheep prepared, and there's obviously a significance to. Well, I mean, you always need shepherds all year round, but of course, then we run into something interesting in the next part of the story. But God appears to these shepherds, right? Or the angels appear to the shepherds, and the importance of that is it doesn't matter who you are. If you're just an everyday person, just like these shepherds are, just everyday guys, the good news about the deliverance, the Messiah coming as the angels proclaim, is for all people. And who are the people that the angels first tell? Just a bunch of Joe Blows, right? Just a bunch of ordinary randos. But at the same time, that the great news about that is you and I are just just everyday randos too, right? We're just people. But the good news of Jesus is for all of us. And that was the point of, that's the significance of, the angels appearing to shepherds, right? In contrast to, when we read the Matthew account, we don't see these angels appearing to like the king, Herod the king, well, because Herod is a pretty shitty human being, right? Like he's an evil guy. So I don't think the angels would have liked to talk to him very much. But, it's not like they appear to the nobles in Jerusalem. No, they appear to the everyday worker represented through shepherds. And it's one of those things where like if you get the chance, you should watch it. There's a show called The Chosen. I know it's been out for a few years now, but The Chosen is basically a way of telling the Jesus story. But the twist of The Chosen is that the story is always told through the perspective of ordinary people. And so the first episode of The Chosen is the birth of Jesus, but told through the perspective of the shepherds. So the main character is one of the shepherds, and the story kind of like just adds like some humor or whatever. because the story, the Chosen takes a very interesting angle where the entirety of most of the first episode has really little to do with like the Jesus story. It's just the shepherd, well, primarily this one shepherd kid, and he's trying to like understand the text, but he's kind of, he's a regular guy. He doesn't have time for like high end study and whatever, right? So he's kind of trying to have someone tell him what the scriptures mean, and some people are like, well, give him different interpretations or whatever, and no one's really sure. And so the shepherd, because no one is really sure, then the shepherd himself isn't sure, and he doesn't really know anything, right? So he's an inexperienced kid who has a lot of like wishy-washy, unsure interpretations of the scriptures. So he's kind of, and to be fair, and what makes the Chosen interesting is that a lot of people would sympathize with the shepherd, right? Because you don't know much yourself, and everyone else around you doesn't know much. So how else are you supposed to understand the scriptures, right? And so in his, you excuse his ignorance is kind of the point of it. That's what the point I'm getting at, is that you excuse his ignorance and you excuse that he's kind of an idiot when it comes to the scriptures, because he doesn't know anything and no one can teach him anything. But then, he's hanging out with his shepherd buddies and they're shooting the shit, laughing about stupid things, right? And just trying to keep themselves busy while they're doing their crappy job, right? And then the angel appears, right? And then they reveal that, like, hey, God has brought, the Messiah that has been prophesied in the scriptures for ages. He is in a manger in Bethlehem. And then, the shepherds are like, whoa, like what's this crazy ass thing going on? And then the shepherds go in, they find the baby Jesus, right, in a manger. So that's the first part of the story. VPAD says Samson's mom was picking in a field. So was his dad. They were both kind of there. Abraham gave his holy angels water for their feet. Well, that would have been customary. Sarah's laughing. How many times in a row can you laugh on that? Does it ever wear out? What ever wear out? Me laughing at bad jokes or something? I don't know what you're getting at with that question. Well, the Abraham thing, if you actually read it, the water thing is implied because it's a customary thing, right? When you have guests over, you should apparently in Jewish custom, you wash your guests' feet because, of course, everybody's walking around with like their crappy sandals and dusty desert lands. So you don't want people tracking sand in your house because sand is a bitch to clean out. Anyone who's got sand stuck in their boot knows exactly what I'm talking about. But that was the main reason why they always wash feet whenever they enter someone's home, right? Because you don't want people tracking sand in your house, which is a bitch to clean. And that's logical sense. I mean, especially when vacuum cleaners didn't exist back then. And even with vacuum cleaners, cleaning sand out sucks. Does it ever? Sarah's laughing. Well, Sarah only has the one laughing thing. Well, I mean, there's the whole joke that Isaac's name means laughter, right? So in a way, it doesn't. If you want to go that technical route. I don't know about that one, VPAD. I'm not 100% with you on that one. Because there are some people that are just so insane that no amount of washing them is gonna. It's more than a physical thing. Because mental health is a serious thing and it's a real thing, and so sometimes it goes beyond just washing a crazy person's feet. But anyway, back to the does it ever wear out? Her laughing at the angel. Well, I mean, it obviously does because then she has the kid. She has Isaac, so there's that. So yeah, it does wear out. Abraham actually originally was not a shepherd. He was kind of a... He might have very well been... Well, Abraham's original job is that he's an idol maker, like his dad, probably. But then, as he ventures out, he actually becomes a warlord, which is actually kind of funny. Because, that's part of surviving in the ancient world. Either you learn to become a warlord, or your people die. That's basically how it is. And so Abraham learned, and he became pretty good at it. And he ends up kicking all kinds of ass later. Okay, let's just try and finish chapter 2, because I just read through the Christmas story part and the whole shepherd thing. But then, the interesting thing, and I tend to think this. Now, this is just like half of it is speculation based on what the next story tells us. So the shepherd thing was also an important detail of the angels appearing to them, because the shepherds would have been in a very important season for when they're taking care of their sheep. Like I said, taking care of sheep would have always been important, but it would have been especially important at this time, that the shepherds in the Christmas story, well, as you will now see, it's not really a Christmas story. It's more like a Halloween story. But we're over 2 months late, but we got this is more of a Halloween story if you think about it. And it's because we get into Luke chapter 1, verse 22, and it's the dedication of Jesus at the temple. Now, in this story, there's a little excerpt about the sacrifice. And the sacrifice is said to be either of a pair of doves or a pair of young pigeons. And of course, when they bring this sacrifice, tells us that it's one of the important feast days. And it is most likely because of the acceptance of birds as being a sacrifice would have suggested that this is the Feast of Tabernacle. Now, we can guess this is the Feast of Tabernacle because of the birds thingy, which is what lets it be possibly tabernacle instead of just Passover. Now, this goes back to the shepherds, because the shepherds, and there's this little funny thing about them neglecting their job to go see the baby Jesus, which would have been really dangerous, especially in this season. Because if it's the Feast of Tabernacle, as the birds thing implies, then basically the shepherds are preparing sheep for sacrifice. So once again, there's the other thing too about like Jesus' birth at this time. And actually, because of this story, we can actually trace a rough idea when Jesus was born, what time of the year. And, as many people like to be as smart as about, clearly Jesus wasn't born at Christmas time. We already know that. People know that. The Bible clearly states that. We know he wasn't born in December. But we can actually make a pretty good guess when he was born. And the good guess is that he was born in almost mid-September. Let's say mid-September. Now, the reason we know this is because simply what we do is we minus 40 days from the Temple of Dedication. And we know the Temple of Dedication would have been during the time of the Feast of Tabernacle. Now, for those of you who don't know what the Feast of Tabernacle is, it's the Jewish equivalent of the Harvest Festival. And the Harvest Festival, of course, in our modern era, we correlate that closely with Halloween. Of course, as I talked about this in the Halloween video, definitely check out the Streaming Parson podcast for that. In the Halloween video, I talked about how one of the major purposes of Halloween in general across cultures, and its close correlation to the Harvest Festival, was the idea that people sacrificed, the first fruit of the harvest. And the purpose of this was to remind people that, don't be selfish, don't be greedy, don't be prideful in your ability to harvest. The harvest was given to you by God or the gods or whatever, right? And so you sacrifice in the Harvest Festival to remind yourself to be humble of your harvest and to be generous, right? Don't be a stingy asshole, basically. And so the Feast of Tabernacle is, for all intents and purposes, a Jewish version of that. And of course, once again, the sacrifices would have been required and such. And the birds thing is brought up because unlike Passover, and we'll talk about Passover a little bit, and why Jesus isn't born in February, for instance. See, in Passover, the sacrifice was way stricter in the Passover. Any Jew will tell you this. In the Passover, it's way stricter. It must be a lamb. It must be a lamb. And of course, there's the correlation with the book of Exodus. And the whole, the killing of the lamb. Well, there's the whole, Exodus thing and God not doing the Grim Reaper thing, to the Israelites. And secondly, there's the metaphorical thing with, Jesus being the Lamb of God and all that, right? But in the Feast of Tabernacle, the birds thing and other things to be sacrificed were allowed because since the Feast of Tabernacle acted as a harvest festival, wealth was, your economic level was considered in what you sacrifice. And this is where, once again, the Bible has a tithe aspect to it as well, and the tenth and all that, right? Because the diversity of stuff allowed to be sacrificed in the Feast of Tabernacle considered people's economic class. And so we actually also know from the story, as a side note, that Joseph and Mary would not have been as wealthy because they sacrificed 2 small birds instead of a lamb. So a lamb, once again, would have been more, higher class, upper class. But for, poorer working class people like Joseph and Mary, they would have had to settle for something smaller. And the 2 birds would have been what was selected for them. And so because of that, we know that, hang on, give me a sec here. I'm just getting some, I'm gonna just get rid of the spam. But basically we know that this is the Feast of Tabernacle that's going on here. And because this is the Feast of Tabernacle, which would have been in October, late October, as like I said, it's closer to Halloween, we can simply just do the minus 40 days. And of course the minus 40 days, I'm not just pulling this number out of my ass, I swear. As the book of Luke says, there's the whole as written, verse 23, as it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord. The book of Luke only takes that part, but if you actually read Exodus 13, the first chunk of Exodus 13, which has this whole rule that sets up between if a firstborn of a family is a boy, you seclude yourself for 40 days and then you bring him to the temple to dedicate him, or the tabernacle in Exodus's time, but you get the idea. You dedicate the child before God 40 days later if it's a boy, and 80 days if it's a girl. The reasons for the number differences are kind of arbitrary, but that's besides the point. The point is, we know that since Jesus is a boy here, then it would have been 40 days. The Feast of Tabernacle is 40 days after when he was born. So the simple calculation would be, okay, if Tabernacle is late October, you just subtract what's roughly 40 days from the end of October would have been early September. So we actually know that Jesus was born in early September. So I know all those people being smart ass saying, well, Jesus wasn't actually born at Christmas. We know the Bible never said that he was born in December. The Bible said he was born closer to September. Well, in September, then he would have been in December. So yeah, there's that. Then we get, just a speed run through the rest of chapter 2. We have these old people, more old people in the story. Then they're oh, they see Jesus, and there's Simeon who's I can finally die now that I've seen the Messiah. Which I gotta say, that's gotta be rough for the old guy, right? Because he's probably any day now. He's probably the Bible doesn't tell us how old he is, but I mean, must be pretty old, and he must have been waiting a while. And I wonder how his attitude would have changed, where it's thank God, now that I know that God's forgiveness is here, I can die. I can die in peace. Which I guess, that's true for all of us today as well, right? When we come to faith in Jesus, is now that I know I'm forgiven of sin and I can live without regret, I can also die without regret. So I mean, I know it took a little bit of a morbid turn there, but at the same time, I think one of the things that should be happening in a Christian's life. It should be that there should be that peace of mind, right? Because knowing that, like, I'm loved by God, I'm forgiven by God, you know, I can live and die without regret, and that's that there must, the peace of mind of that, is priceless, right? And I wonder that's probably what's going on in Simeon's mind, that priceless feeling of like that true peace of mind. Because once again, if you like try to imagine like the mind of a Jewish person, in the first century, right? And you have this spiritual drought, and you're like, am I ever right before God or whatever? And you don't know, and you're just like scrambling, trying to do whatever you can to try and please God, but you can never be sure whether you've done enough or whatever, right? But then Jesus comes, and we see it through Simeon. It's like the peace of mind that comes to him, and that's something that we should all try to. How do I put it? What's that word? We try to so now it slips my mind. The idea of like to always know, right? And to always think about and always, have in your mind that like, I have Jesus in my life and I can now be at peace, right? I can have real peace in my life and not, be anxious and paranoid despite all the crazy shit that happens in real life, right? But with the grace of God and the forgiveness of God, we can have peace, and we can face the crazy ass world out there with resolve, because there's no regrets, right? I have that peace of God that gives me the strength to live. And then of course it's the same thing with Hannah or Anna. I say Hannah because the Greek version keeps the rough breathing mark, so it makes you wonder why the English translation decided to ditch the H, but whatever. Translator, you do you, I guess. All right, finally we're gonna close out because it's almost 5:30 and I kind of need to end the stream soon. But basically, we're gonna finish off with the 12-year-old Jesus story. So this is verse 41 to 52, and it's a short excerpt. I don't know why the Book of Luke bothered to add this in, but I guess once again actually I do know. There's a pretty obvious answer to it, but it's kind of weird that the writer decides to put it in this way, I guess is what I meant. So basically it's like, okay, so we're at a Passover, and this is the other thing too, going back with the dedication story of why it's not Passover but likely the Feast of Tabernacle, is because the next story makes a note to say it was Passover when Jesus is 12 years old. And of course, if we follow how calendars work, the 12-year-old Jesus going at Passover, this would have been before his 13th birthday. And of course, in Jewish tradition, there's the bar mitzvah, which is like a boy's a rite of passage, right? So you're not a boy anymore. You're a man at the age of 13, right? Because that's how a lot of older cultures do things, right? Every society has their own version of. There's like a sense of becoming a man, if you will, at the age of 13. Like you're no longer a kid. At the very least, you're no longer a kid. And so the bar mitzvah, in Jewish culture would have been, same thing like when they're 13. So once again, this adds more to the likelihood that Jesus was born in September, because we have the Passover on when he's 12, which would have been the last Passover before he's 13. And so this last Passover before he's 13, it's interesting that, the Bible story tells this moment where, Mary and Joseph take Jesus to Jerusalem to do Passover, as you do. And then Jesus stays behind, and he's at the temple, and he's teaching and talking to people and stuff. And when Mary's like, "What the hell, kid? Like, you had us worried. We were anxiously looking for you. why did you do this to us? And then he says, well, did you not know I had to be in my Father's house and be about his business? And so there's this interesting, before he even hits the bar mitzvah, if you will, Jesus is already adopting his purpose, right? His purpose of, being the teacher of Israel, being, God's messenger to the people of salvation, right? That he is that, and ultimately the instrument of God's salvation, but more on that later. But basically, Jesus is already in that mindset, even before he's, on the road to manhood with his bar mitzvah. And so once again, I think the tabernacle birth of Jesus works a lot better for this reason as well, right? That when we read the 12-year-old Jesus, the 12-year-old Jesus in Jerusalem, and he stays at the temple and all that, you can see that, right? You can see that he's already taking up, the road to manhood, if you will, even before he's had his bar mitzvah. Which once again kind of shows that, he's exceptional. He's far wiser beyond his years and all that stuff. Being the Son of God and all that. But basically, he's much more than what meets the eye, right? And Mary has to, always think about this, that this is who Jesus is. Right? And there's a little funny twist in that too, because of course there's the, we can laugh about whether Mary and Joseph's parenting skills were actually good, because they left the 12-year-old kid in Jerusalem during like the busiest time of year. Real good job there. But I mean, to be fair, there was probably other kids to deal with, so there's that. Of course, other things too, right? When you're traveling in a family pack, you just assume everyone's going to be, with the program. But, Jesus's agenda is different, right? And his agenda is to be doing the Lord's work, and hence at the temple, right? And so those three stories of the birth of Jesus, dedication of the temple, and then 12-year-old Jesus, they kind of point that like he's so much more, right? Of course, once again, as modern readers, and similar to like the original audience of the book of Luke, they would have known this. They would have known this already, right? Because this is the book of Luke is supposed to remind people why the book of Acts even happened, right? And the book of Acts people would have been well aware of, right? But this chapters 1 and 2, and I kind of wish I did chapter 3, because chapter 3 follows the same kind of vein, but it's basically this setup, right? There's this huge setup of Jesus has come on earth, and something awesome is going to happen, right? Spoilers for a 2,000-year-old book, but the resurrection and the forgiveness of sins, right? But if we're reading it from a chronological sense, Luke in chapters 1 and 2, and also chapter 3, but I didn't read chapter 3 today. We'll have to just cover it next week. But basically, there's this hyping of this, there's a hyping in the story. We're hyping up, something awesome is going to happen, and here's, Jesus enters the scene, right? And so that's how the story begins, right? And now there's this big hype, and I think it's appropriate that we read the hype story, in Luke 1 and 2, as we start 2022. Ha ha ha! I did not do that intentionally though. I swear. But like, the hype is here, right? The hype is here is basically what Luke is getting at, and it's a great way to start off 2022 in our Bible read for the foreseeable future. God willing, assuming the world doesn't end tomorrow, because that's very possible too, right? But anyway, I think I'm saturated in my study for today. We'll obviously come back to some later, like some Luke 2 notes, because we have to talk about it when we do Luke 3 as well. So, but we're going to end it here. If you enjoyed hanging out today and reading through Luke 1 and 2, you can join us next Friday at 3 o'clock Pacific time as we continue through the book of Luke. As for the upcoming week of video content on this channel, Monday, I'll be starting up the Streaming Parson podcast. That's coming back. Streaming Parson podcast. I don't know why I named it that, because it's obviously a terrible tongue twister that I always get caught on my own tongue twister. But the Streaming Parson podcast will be resuming on Monday, and it will be at 4 o'clock Pacific time. Just gonna do a New Year's, hey guys, we're here in the new year, 2022, even though I've already done some videos. But hey, we're doing an official podcast start of 2022. That's on Monday at 4 o'clock Pacific time. And then, of course, next week we got a lot of content, right? We got a podcast. We're playing more Rise Eterna on Wednesdays at 2 o'clock. So, I know the time things of each different stream is like different times. I know I could be like really annoyed. It's like, why don't you just start the same time for every single one of them? But like, podcast doesn't need that long, and gaming streams need a lot of time, right? But Wednesday we have Rise Eterna and continuing that game. And then Thursday, we have more Throwback Thursday with Heroes of Might and Magic 2. And then, of course, next Friday at 3 o'clock, we will be continuing on starting with Luke chapter 3 as we kick into the new year of our Bible reads. So that's it for housekeeping. I have to get going because it's like 5:30, and normally we got to get food pretty soon. And so I got to do all the takeouts. Because the funny thing, I don't know if you guys have figured this out already, but Friday is like our takeout day, right? Because normally we just cook at home most of the days, but Friday is usually our takeout day. And originally I was hesitant to do a takeout today because Vancouver, it snowed. It snowed, right? It snowed like crazy. At least it wasn't as bad during Christmas time, but there was a lot of snow. And especially this last week, like right after New Year's, it snowed like a lot. But yesterday it rained. It rained and melted a lot of that snow. And I'm like, yes! Rain in Vancouver. everyone else is probably like, no, we like the snow. I was like, no, you don't. You don't like the snow. You hate the snow because you can't drive in it. That's how you know. Like, that's why I hate snow. I know a lot. Like, you look at the roads and you can tell people can't drive when there's snow. But it rained, so a lot of the snow's gone, and I'm happy about it. So we're gonna celebrate with some takeout. But anyway, this is going to be the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed reading through Luke 1 and 2 with me. I will see you guys next week. I'll see you guys Monday for the Streaming Parson podcast. I hope you guys have a great rest of your night. And I hope you guys have a great weekend too. God bless you. And Happy New Year.